This is the tui chub. Despite its name, it's not a particularly fat fish. But it does eat a lot of insects and zooplankton from the lakes and rivers where they're native in the West, including the Columbia, the Snake, Lake Tahoe, and the Klamath River. But elsewhere, the tui chub is invasive and throws ecosystems out of balance. They're persona non grata. Okay, pescana non grata. Well, you get it, they aren't welcome. And this has been the case in Oregon's Diamond Lake for more than 60 years. Back in the 1950s, Oregon wanted to make the lake a premier fishing spot for stocked rainbow trout. But to improve water quality and ensure there was enough food, the state decided the non-native tui chub already living there had to go. So wildlife officials drained down the water and dumped 100 tons of a poison called rotenone into the lake. It was curtains for the chub, 32 million of them, and most everything else in the lake. And Diamond Lake became one gem of a fishing spot. Sorry. But in 1992, much to everyone's shock, tui chub were found in the lake once again. But how could that have happened? Nope. Not likely. It probably went something like this. Using live bait in Diamond Lake is illegal, by the way. As the chub multiplied over the next decade, the water became cloudy and the trout numbers dipped. So, the state poisoned the lake again in 2006. And this time killed 90 million chub. Fishermen flocked back to Diamond Lake. But the story doesn't end there. In 2015, another chub was found in the lake. Yep, one single chub. But can there just be one? Or is this the beginning of another invasion? And what weapons will be used next in the Great War on chubs? Early mornings are quiet in the high desert. Unseen birds are sparing with their calls. A silent rabbit chances breakfast in the tall, dry grass. As the desert wakes up, so does the camp on Hedgehog Ridge, high above the John Day River Valley. One by one, volunteers with the Oregon Natural Desert Association, or ONDA, emerge from their tents and greet the morning with strong coffee and small words. They begin preparing for a day of backcountry and barbed wire. And before the sun rises too high, the group heads out.
I'm Fred Sawyer. Yesterday was my birthday. I was 66 years old. So on my birthday, I got to come out on this Honda trip and four-wheel drive up here to Pine Creek Conservation Area. Pulling fence.
Pulling fence posts, rolling wire, lugging the steel posts that are up the hills to get them to where we can get them out with a vehicle on the edge of the wilderness area, and that's what the whole job's about. Done.
Barbed wire fencing has been on this land since the late 1800s, soon after the first white settlers began putting down roots in central and eastern Oregon. Volunteers like retired Lapine science teacher M.J. Hare are giving up one of the final weekends of summer to help pull some of the last remaining fence off this land.
Even when I was teaching, I would bring my bags with me and run out and change my clothes and hop in the car, and off I'd go to one of these trips. So it's been part of my life for quite a while.
Jefferson Jacobs is leading the trip.
There is so much landscape out here that is not in its entire natural state that just needs a little nudge to get on a different trajectory.
Fencing can be a good thing, keeping grazing animals out of sensitive environments. But when barbed wire becomes obsolete and is left out on the range, it can create serious problems for wildlife. Removing unneeded fence from Pine Creek and other protected areas like Hart Mountain and the Steens in Oregon has long been a conservation priority.
It can alter how wildlife move through the landscape and can exclude them from important things like springs or easy travel routes or predator-free areas.
The group's volunteers have pulled and hauled more than 500 miles of obsolete fencing across the state. Other conservation groups from Washington to Wyoming have undertaken similar work. And some of the volunteers have witnessed the more gruesome consequence of old fencing.
We came across a bighorn sheep that had got its horns tangled in the wire. I mean, it was long past, but still it must have been a horrific way to go. And it was definitely a reminder of why the fence needs to go.
The group has taken down fence in this area before. In the past, they were able to remove about a mile of it per day, but not on this trip.
This fence is kind of left for last because it is a hard fence.
It runs deep in a canyon, down scree slopes and along rocky ledges. Every pulled post and barbed wire roll is packed out of the canyon. And by the end of the day, the group is exhausted.
Today was a little bit on the brutal side. We were on the side of a hill. It got hot today. It's the steepest place I've ever removed fence.
This is the hardest fence pull we have ever done. I don't think anybody up there would say otherwise.
But there's a quarter-mile less fence on Pine Creek. With this shared exhaustion comes the camaraderie of shared experiences and a feeling of ownership, responsibility, and affinity for this small corner of Central Oregon.
It's the reward of looking over your shoulder as you're leaving and not seeing any fence, and how beautiful that looks, just open and free.
And the next morning, they'll head down into the canyon once again to pull more fence and return another stretch of rangeland to wilderness. Before there was an armed occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in eastern Oregon, before there was Ammon Bundy demanding that federal lands be handed over to locals, before Teddy Roosevelt created any national wildlife refuges at all, there were hats. Elaborate, feathered hats worn by women. Women caught up in a fashion craze that was sweeping Europe and the United States in the late 1800s. To feed the haute couture appetites of the upper classes, so-called plume hunters were crossing the country, killing millions upon millions of birds for their feathers. In 1898, the plume hunters found Malheur Lake. According to photographer William Finley, a pair of hunters wiped out the population of white herons or egrets in just a day and a half.
Malheur has seen many such massacres, but none so great as that.
10 years later, when Finley explored the Malheur marshes, the egrets were still gone.
I am satisfied that of the thousands of white herons formerly nesting on Malheur, not a single pair of birds is left.
In response to the devastation he found, Finley helped to establish what is now the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. More than a century later, the 300-square-mile refuge is one of the most important migratory bird sites in North America. 320 different species of birds pass through the refuge each year, and the white heron is back. In fall and winter, hunting is still allowed, but highly regulated. Hundreds of hunters visit the refuge each year in search of pheasant and other game birds. But most people just come to look and take photos like William Finley did in 1908. In a strange way, the histories of Finley and the Bundy clan have become intertwined. Both made stands at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, though for very different reasons. But by choosing this small corner of eastern Oregon, they're both now part of the same story that begins with the tyranny of women's hats.